Welcome to Wharton Tech Toks, everybody. This is your host, Sophie. We are super excited to be talking to Jay Richman with Spotify today. But before we jump into the bios, I'm here with my lovely counterpart, Chris. Chris, say hello to everybody.
Hey, everyone.
Now moving on to our featured guest. So Jay Richman is Spotify's Vice President, Head of Global Advertising Business and Platform. He's spent his career at the intersection of digital media and ad tech. His positions at NBC, Universal, Scholastic, and Bertelsmann taught him how to build consumer ad experiences that deliver for companies, brands, and creators. In his role at Spotify, he especially takes pride in delivering standout promotional experiences for listeners, artist teams, and advertisers, helping to bring free music and podcasts to the world. We are so excited to be talking with Jay today. A lot of back and forth with his team to get this scheduled, so we really appreciate him taking the time. Jay has a really interesting career. So moving through his trajectory from product management to now Spotify on their advertising team, he's been with the company for about 8 years. So Jay, thank you for joining us and walk us through a little bit of your career trajectory within Spotify and the space and what has brought you to where you are today.
Awesome. Thanks, Sophie. And hi, Chris. Great to be here. Thanks for having me on. This could be the start of a podcast, career, fingers crossed. And so, happy to get into it. Maybe interesting to know, native New Yorker, born and raised on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, product of the public school system, studied computer science in high school, business at university. I graduated into the tail end of the Web 1.0 boom, which afforded me a lot of opportunities to wear lots of hats. I started off with a company called Bertelsmann, German media conglomerate, owns music labels, publishing, print, etc. And I worked in their clubs division, dating myself here, but BMG Music Club and Doubleday Book Clubs were like two of the largest, where you would pay basically $1, get 6 CDs, and we would mail you on a subscription basis like a new CD that we thought you'd be interested every month until you cancel. While within the big conglomerate, I was watching upstarts like Amazon rise and really became enamored with how fast and how ambitious they were, and simultaneously frustrated with how hard it was to kind of innovate and keep pace in a company that I thought would have had all of the natural advantages of scale and resources, etc. Wound up leaving, joining the startup scene, worked for a web dev shop called Seed right before the bottom started to drop out of the Web 1.0 market. We were both venture backed, as were our clients. And so leapt to what I thought was safer ground, a company called CMGI. It was kind of like the IAC at the time, but their strategy was to accumulate all of the second place internet companies. So they owned AltaVista, not Google. They owned Ubid, not eBay. And they owned ExchangePath, which is a company I joined, not PayPal. So I watched that company go from about a $50 billion market cap to zero over the course of maybe 9 months with them. Then did a leap to another failed startup before realizing like just how difficult it is to build a great enduring brand. So that's where kind of my career started to go back towards this Weight Watchers, Scholastics, like NBCs of the world, where I really tried to take what I learned as an entrepreneur and bring it to these big established enduring brands and establish myself as what they called an intrapreneur. And, I had some good and modest successes along the way, probably the most telling of which was the launch of Hulu while at NBC Universal. I was part of the incubation team prior to it being spun out into its own joint venture. In fact, I worked on Hulu before it was called Hulu. It was referred to as ClownCo.
I like the new name better.
Much better. But I don't think the market was giving us a fighting chance. At how, mortal enemies in the network space. In that case, it was, Fox and NBC could like launch something compelling from a consumer standpoint. But we got it out the door ahead of spinning it off into its own venture and, hiring its CEO. And I think the rest is history. So proud to be a small footnote in the Hulu journey. And kind of along the way, I had experience in lots of different like monetization models. I got to do the subscription thing at Bertelsmann. kind of glossed over what I did at Weight Watchers, but that was like an online weight loss subscription service in the kind of early mid aughts, a bit ahead of its time. I got to do e-commerce with Scholastic. I was there during kind of the Harry Potter craze and was looking to really just migrate their business to be more digital. And then at NBC, my focus was on advertising. Once you kind of build something of consumer appeal, you very quickly get asked to turn around and monetize it. I kind of did that, rinse and repeat a few times ahead of leaving for a mid-size ad network where I got to run all of products. Company called Vibrant Media. Ultimately found that to be way less satisfying because I didn't have that kind of consumer feedback loop. We were kind of an intermediary player and found it was way less satisfying to build products when who you're building for isn't the ultimate end consumer. And so when it came time to leave Vibrant, I took my neighbor at the time, who was the editor-in-chief at Ad Age, explained to him what my dream job was. And he asked me, this is kind of circa 2012, had I thought about Spotify. And Spotify at the time was a brand that was very much on my radar. I was a premium subscriber. I had my Sonos system streaming through, but I hadn't thought about them as a tech company. I hadn't thought of them. I didn't even know they were New York based, to be honest. And he connected me, my neighbor that is, with the CRO of Spotify at the time. And before I could get the perfect email crafted to kind of weasel a coffee out of him, he responded to me with 5 or 6 people in copy. And long story short, it turns out that they were looking for somebody with my exact background. The search had been open for a year plus. They want somebody who got ad tech, who was business savvy, but also understood the consumer side and could build products that end users ultimately would love. And that kind of the story of how I got to Spotify.
Awesome. So you've been focused on the ad tech space for most of your Spotify career.
Correct. So I actually joined to be the first PM of ads. And the way I actually was sold on the job was come build a startup within the larger growth organization. There was nobody really focusing on ads. I inherited a team of, I think it was 2 people that were focusing on the product development side. And so having spent time at startups, having spent time at big media, this was kind of my first opportunity to try to do the startup thing, but within a larger growth environment. And whether they meant it or not, that was my model. And so what happened was I wound up recruiting my own founding team, personally recruiting just based off of my entire career up until that point. I got to call the very best people from all of those companies I've ever had the opportunity to work with. And one by one, I kind of recruited them over to Spotify. And we were this founding team of about 7, comprised of the full complement of product development skills. We were fairly isolated at the time and heads down.
Right.
And after having shown a few strings of success, the company got excited that we could be kind of a dual revenue business, that we could have mixed monetization, which we had thought could be really, really special. So I went from basically being the first PM. And by the way, I took a big step back in my career. I was at that point, leading an entire product organization for a mid-sized company of about 300 folks, to becoming a PM because I just believed in the opportunity. And was really excited by the challenge and the mission. And so I started off by doing the job very much, hands-on, to then leading a product organization, to then leading an R&D organization, inclusive of engineering, design, data science, user research, to now leading the entire business unit, inclusive of ad sales, marketing, and operations. And so while my mission in some respects hasn't changed over the 8+ years I've been at Spotify, the scope certainly has. And I now find myself managing a mid-sized company within a conglomerate.
Yeah, definitely. So for all of our career switchers out there, you heard it here first. Don't be afraid to take a step back to go forward. Worked out for Jay and hopefully can work out for all of our listeners too. But ads and tech is a really interesting aspect of this growing kind of streaming business. So music, podcasts, even TV shows and movies. And I think Spotify has really revolutionized this. I was reading about the streaming ad insertion. So from your perspective, since you've been working on ad tech for a while now, how have you seen the technology change, and why is streaming ad insertion so revolutionary for Spotify?
To understand the benefits of streaming ad insertion, or we refer to it internally as SAI, you need to understand the problem that we set out to solve. And for that, you need to understand how podcast advertising works today, which I liken to more of like out of home than digital media. Podcast ads are more like the ones that you see on a billboard by the side of the highway or in the subway or above a taxi. And that's because they can't precisely be targeted, measured, or interacted with. And so, not surprisingly, the biggest advertisers in the space are the same between out of home and podcasts. That's why you see the Casper mattresses and the other D2C brands who've basically figured a hack around all of those constraints, which is the coupon code and the vanity URL, which allow them to measure in however crude a way some form of attribution, some way to understand the efficacy of their ad spend. And so that's kind of the space as it stands today. And as a result, it's tiny. You've got 100 million plus monthly active listeners to podcasts in the US. And we're talking about an industry that's hopefully going to approach $1 billion in ad sales. So there's this enormous value gap. And that's because the largest kind of best capitalized brands in the world have been stood on the outside because they can't get confirmation that they reached the audience that they intended to. There's no way for consumers to interact and engage with their brands, and all of the things that they've grown accustomed to, a Facebook ad or a Google ad, they just don't have because the media is, again, more like out of home than digital. And so all of those things, all of those constraints, they go away when you shift the model from downloads to streaming. With downloads, you're basically embedding the ad into the show at the time that it's being downloaded, regardless of whether the consumer ever listens to the show or whether they listen far enough or deep enough into the show to reach an ad break. And so you have a targeting challenge and you have a measurement challenge. Once you move to streaming, and it's all happening in real time, we're able to insert the ad at the time that the break comes up. We're able to reach people based on their true identity, and we're able to report back to the advertiser, confirmation that we delivered what indeed they purchased. And so whereas from maybe a digital marketing perspective, that doesn't sound so transformational. From a podcast marketing perspective, it's an enormous leap forward, and that's why we're so excited about SAI and why I think this space is going to grow well beyond historic heights and where analysts have pegged it.
Right. And I think it's been growing pretty significantly, right? One of the big things that's been exciting is that people tend to listen to the ads, even though maybe, there's some of that disconnect of downloads being able to get all of that information. People tend to not pause, right? You're listening to it while you're eating dinner, or you try to skip 30 seconds ahead and you skip too far. But right, I think a lot of people tend to listen to them. And so I think it's super exciting that you can have more targeted ads with personalization, things that people might be looking for. You listen to, Pod Save America or something like that. And you, also are looking for, new pair of headphones. You can hopefully find the right ones.
Despite all the shade I just threw over the current state of podcast advertising, they still are incredibly effective. And I think it's because of the format. The one thing that podcast ads really have right is the creative format. I think the intimacy of going between content and the host, the duration of the spot, and because most shows tend to be niche in nature, you do have some level of targeting. And so the fact that they can work well from a direct response perspective, despite all of those hoops and lack of measurement, to me is really compelling, because if you can preserve that and scale that and then layer on solutions to all of the deficiencies, then you can really take this medium to very, very exciting heights.
And I really like what you said, right, about the medium, the formatting. It feels very personal. Sometimes you'll have the podcast host talk about the product or talk about how much they love it, which I feel adds an extra level of credence and makes me want to listen to, what they have to say about it. And it actually kind of makes me wonder a little bit more about, I've been reading about Ad Studio at Spotify. And so, right, it used to, I think, mostly be for music, but now I think it's looking to kind of evolve and grow towards podcast advertising. So I'd love to hear more about how kind of Ad Studio works and maybe how you guys are supercharging advertising.
We're putting a ton of innovation effort into this space. You can look at SAI is the new baseline, modernizing the experience for advertisers while preserving the experience for consumers. One thing before I go into Ad Studio that's worth noting is that we're trying to, so through this lens of kind of preserving like what's working great and then building on top, we introduced this product called in-app offers, which is basically designed to productize the coupon code. And so this notion of like having to hear a host repeat a code or event a URL like 3 times so that it's born in your brain, you remember to enter it into a browser sometime later. The ability to actually redeem the code right from within the app is something that we're in active testing right now and are seeing really exciting, promising results. So you can envision a world where you could actually redeem or have like a coupon catalog to go back to of spots that you heard but couldn't have otherwise remembered. And as far as Ad Studio, so that's our self-serve platform. What it's aiming to do is offer advertisers, large and small, access to creators, large and small. You have this like really interesting, somewhat unique phenomenon based on some of the constraints I just shared of having kind of the smallest brands in the world sponsoring the largest shows out there. Right. So you have the smallest brands like these D2C brands, because the big ones are staying on the sidelines because they don't have the measurement or targeting needed. But it's because of how labor intensive it is to buy a show. It really only makes sense to spend your energy on the largest ones so that you get the biggest bang for your buck. So the biggest shows are actually monetizing fairly well. And then the vast majority of creators go unmonetized at all. They don't have any ads. It's just not too much friction associated with like aggregating lots of small shows into audience buys that advertisers would see as worth their effort. And so Ad Studio aims to solve that by allowing, again, advertisers big and small to access creators big and small. And the way that we do that is we start to shift the industry from buying on a show basis to buying on an audience basis. And once you're buying on an audience basis and you're looking to reach consumers of X demographic, X location, X interest, we can then find those consumers across the broadest swath of listening possible, which is inclusive of music. And so take, for example, a marketer who's looking to reach consumers interested in personal finance. Well, you can reach that consumer while listening to a personal finance podcast, but you could also reach that user while they're listening to a music context based on their behavioral profile of having consumed personal finance shows in the past. So I think that's like really interesting and a great opportunity for Spotify that has amassed a critical number of listeners and creators like all in one streaming platform, which enables us to offer experiences like the one I just described that wouldn't otherwise be feasible in how podcasts have worked historically.
Definitely. I think even taking a step backward, Spotify has made significant investments within the podcast space. So this area has been growing compared to, traditionally when you think about Spotify, you think about music, but now podcasts are a huge portion of the business and the strategy and the revenue. I actually just read an article that Spotify podcasts are estimated to exceed Apple, which is huge because you had the Megaphone acquisition, you have these targeted ads. So all of these investments are starting to pay off. But I think the bigger question is why now? Why are podcasts becoming so popular? And what has been just Spotify's overall strategy for creating all of these really cool marketplaces and innovating on the technology that's supporting both ends? Because it's a two-sided marketplace. You have the creators and the listeners. So what is Spotify's strategy in attacking this?
Yeah, so maybe I'll try to answer it through two lenses. Like what's happened industry-wise for audio to be seeing this great moment, and then what are we doing within Spotify to add fuel to the fire? I think it's worth noting that there are a number of kind of preconditions that have been met for the audio internet to be taking off the way that it is. And that has to do with infrastructure build out, which has lagged that of video, text for the longest. Now that the home is being connected with smart speakers and the car is being wired up and you have the Internet of Things, you think about the number of platforms on which audio can be consumed has just really exploded over the last few years. And we're not talking about like small music moments. We're talking about like the largest moments, right? The car, the home, these are like, the killer platforms for listening, much like the smart TV was a precondition for the various video streamers. I think it was like in 2015, like all new televisions were being shipped with internet connectivity, right? It really is only 2020, 2019, that all new cars and all speakers were being shipped with internet connectivity. So that's kind of like point one, is that the infrastructure has been built out to enable the next generation of digital audio to flourish. As far as what Spotify is doing, so we had a whole flood of announcements at our Stream On event last week, and it was a really interesting time of reflection for us employees, as we're able to see like just how far we've come, while also laying out what we think will drive audio streaming in the ecosystem forward in the future. And so about 2 years ago, we announced our plans to get into the podcasting space in a big way. And since then, we launched our own content studio to produce content in the podcast space. We purchased a number of other ones, including Gimlet, Parcast, The Ringer. We've been licensing up some of the world's largest shows like Joe Rogan, which we just took exclusive to the platform. We purchased, as we were talking before we started recording, Anchor, which is a platform that supports next generation creators. And so, within 2 short years, Spotify is now as much a media company as it is a technology one, and you can feel it in just like where the resources are and in the culture of the team. We've, as a result, now amassed over 2 million podcasts on the platform, the majority of them being powered via Anchor. We've got 345 million listeners on Spotify each month. 25% are now listening to podcasts. And so like the whole string of announcements last week were all predicated on us having achieved this critical mass of listeners and creators on one single platform, which is what provides this like great innovation opportunity. And so that's the context for us rolling out new creative formats and monetization opportunities for creators. And as we just were discussing, of particular interest and excitement for me is the Spotify Audience Network, which happens to be my project.
Oh, awesome. And then, so you have the audience network. How is that similar or different to the advertising network? Or are they both combined and you're just working with this audience network to like create and release and monetize your content?
Yeah, the Spotify Audience Network is the brand name for what we announced at Stream On.
Okay, got it. And then, like, how has the Megaphone acquisition, for example, kind of played into the spur of either how these podcasts are going to be reported, created, or monetized? And then has it played a part in just the overall technology innovation?
Yeah, we see Megaphone as a huge accelerant to our strategy. And so just to get the kind of taxonomy right, we've got the Spotify Audience Network, which is our kind of aggregation play, music, Anchor creators, Megaphone publishers, owned and exclusive content, all made available for advertisers to easily buy audiences across using Ad Studio. Megaphone is a enterprise publishing platform that hosts, distributes, and monetizes content that we wouldn't otherwise have monetization access to. And so SAI, which we were talking about just earlier, has been a real game changer for our business. It's been sold out since Q3 of last year, which means that there's just like way more demand for it than supply. And so when we looked at the Megaphone opportunity, we saw it as a great way of scaling SAI beyond our own and exclusive shows to some of the largest publishing brands in the world. And by getting them to adopt, we see a great opportunity for all ships to rise.
And I think just like the feature set of Megaphone just looks so exciting. I mean, I think you were talking about earlier, right? Some of the barriers and problems with advertising, kind of like the dynamic insertion, or just like, being able to really track who's your audience. Are people seeing your ads or not? I was like looking at the feature set and I was like, oh man, I really wish we had this for Wharton Tech Toks. But I'd love to hear more about, some of the other things that you're excited about.
Yeah, well, first off, come on over. I'm sure the Megaphone team would love to have you guys as new customers. Yeah, they were far and away the best in class offering out in the market. They deal with some of the largest publishers in the space. They cater towards the enterprise segment of the market. So a real pro tool. And as far as how much innovation you could bring to the RSS based, download world, like they are on the absolute bleeding edge of that innovation. And so we saw a team, we saw a business, we saw an opportunity to accelerate, both missions by bringing them together. So now Megaphone, in addition to all of the great stuff that they've been able to achieve on their own, has access to Spotify data and insights. Their publishers have access to our global sales force, which means, larger checks for them. And we're just starting to scratch the surface. We're less than a quarter in to the integration, and all of the things that we had kind of like dreamt up, right? When you're putting like the rationale docs together, and so far, played out. Plus we've uncovered a few more rocks I hadn't even realized existed, which has me even more excited than at the time that we were writing the check. And so I think like the combination of them having taken the current paradigm as far as you possibly could on behalf of the creator community, and now gaining them access to the new paradigm that is streaming, I think the possibilities for the combined teams are really limitless.
Definitely. And I think we've covered a lot of interesting topics. So we've talked about ad tech, Spotify's ad studio, more of the podcast side. But I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the algorithms and the machine learning that's going on in Spotify. So we've covered one aspect, but Spotify primarily or originally known for the music streaming side. So I don't know how involved you are with the machine learning that's going on behind these algorithms, but how has Spotify Discover evolved with the advancements that we've seen within algorithms and within this AI machine learning landscape?
Yep. So machine learning and personalization plays, as you mentioned, a huge role at Spotify. And that is true for a couple of reasons. One, we have all of the world's music through which to navigate. That's upwards of 70 million songs. And it's the same 70 million songs that exist on competing platforms. So it's both a consumer challenge and an opportunity to differentiate our offering from others. For both of those reasons, we've invested quite a bit. What might be interesting for your listeners is, rather than kind of geeking out about the deep tech, I can talk a little bit about our approach or our mental model to personalization, which started back probably in 2014 or so, where Spotify was really a power user tool. It was really meant for like music aficionados, folks that knew their interests and would effectively program their day through sound. And we observed these power users who had very high music IQs and were very skilled at playlisting. And we likened them to software programmers. And we likened playlisting to a programming language. And we thought, okay, well, how can we make these software programmers more productive? So we started to build tools that made their playlisting much easier. We started to autocomplete playlists, for example. And then eventually those playlists became self-driving and self-generating. And then we were able to create them for the masses. And so over time, you didn't need to be an expert in music, or you didn't need to know how to program a playlist. We were able to do that for the masses on their behalf. And as you get more and more consumers on the platform listening to what we've put in front of them, you get more and more data on which to improve those recommendations. And because of the nature of music, which is a series of 3-minute clips, we get lots of information within any given session. I think that is probably the biggest and maybe least understood thing about ML is the importance of those reinforcement loops. It's a big part of why like TikTok is so wildly successful, is because think about how short that content is and how many times within a session they have to learn about what you're interested in. You think about Facebook and how many stories you scroll past and how many you linger on. And then you juxtapose that with, say, Netflix, which could have all of the capabilities in the world. But if you're listening to one 30-minute show or one 2-hour movie, you have way fewer opportunities on which to learn and therefore personalize. So kind of at one end of the spectrum, limited catalog with slow feedback loops, maybe being more of the SVOD space. Kind of at the other end of the spectrum, you have like TikTok, and every few seconds you're getting some reinforcement learning. Spotify is much closer to the TikTok side of the house than the streaming video side, and I think that's a big part of our success.
And, I think on that topic, the playlists are just so amazing, right? My dad, who's a really big audiophile, recently had been raving about the playlists on Spotify, and I gifted him a Spotify subscription for his birthday. And so it's just so interesting to see things like EcoNest, like with acquisition in the past, and some of the really cool tools. I was actually nerding out myself looking at the SDK about like the different things you can look at. Like, does the music have energy? Does it have danceability, loudness? I think it's just like so cool to think about all of these amazing features that you can get, like you kind of said, in that reinforcement of people playing, 3-minute clips, a minute and a half, and even just thinking about Discover, where artists can say, hey, I think this might be a really cool track for, a certain playlist, or Marquee, where, artists and creators have opportunity to grow their fan base. I think it's so exciting today to see, right? Like I was watching the conference with Spotify, and how the amount of songs in 1 year, I think was 30,000 in 2002. And in 2020 alone, it was like 1.8 million. And so seeing creators having this opportunity through mediums like Spotify to create new incredible content and potentially get a larger audience through cool tools like Marquee and Discovery is so exciting.
Yeah, no, totally. And you're taking me down memory roads with the EcoNest, our first big push really in the ML space. What they had was deep sonic understanding. They studied the music and were actually powering recommendations, mainly like radio station recommendations for many of our competitors of the day, but they didn't understand anything about the consumer. And so we had lots of data and insight around consumers, such as the context that they were in, which turned out to be super interesting dimension on which to evaluate music. I remember at one point in our history, we said, well, what if we started to compare music moments to more typical genres? And so we kind of plotted it all out, and you all of a sudden had rock on the same footing as, say, running or dining. And what we quickly found was that these music moments, which you could tell from a lot of just how playlists got named, were quite a bit larger than the traditional genres. And so you saw, so the insight was that folks were traversing the catalog through very different means than they had historically. They weren't going to the record store and going to the rock section and then finding their favorite artist and then finding the album. They were talking about what mood or moment were they in, and then they were trying to find the perfect music or the perfect audio to soundtrack. And that turned out to be a really important insight. And then together, that sonic understanding and that consumer insight allowed us to really birth wholly new experiences like Discover Weekly, which is actually not to bring us so obviously back to ads, but is pretty similar to how we program our ad experience. We actually talk about our ad server as being the Discover Weekly of ads, and that's because we ingest positive signals like clicks, negative signals like skips, and that all gets fed into a recommendation engine that over time learns about your interests and starts to personalize ads in much the same way that we personalize content. And that's where Ad Studio becomes so critical, because we don't have the same 70 million individual pieces of content to choose from when making a recommendation. You can't get that by only focusing on kind of the head of the market. You need to have a nice long tail of advertisers and creative assets on which to act on those recommendations. And so I don't know, you can maybe start to see how all of the pieces fit together. You've got recommendation tech, which we use for personalizing more things than content, but the advertiser experience as well. And then we're trying to get as much content onboarded on to the platform in the form of ad creatives, similar to how we're trying to attract more creators with simple tools like Anchor. You could think about Ad Studio being that similar kind of self-serve DIY tool for advertisers.
Definitely. And I'm very sad to say this, but we are coming up on time. However, you've had such an interesting entrepreneurial career. And earlier in the chat, you mentioned entrepreneur. So I'd love to get your advice to our fellow listeners who are either embarking on their entrepreneurial journey or thinking about it. What advice do you have for them in terms of embarking on that journey, trends to look for, and just what they should avoid?
Yeah, I would say I guess my number one piece of advice is find the right environments for you. More important than role. Like you're going to get the role wrong. You don't know. You don't know exactly what you want to do or what you're going to excel at, and your job's going to turn, many, many times over. So you want to give yourself as many, chances for experience as possible, and you want to do that in a growing environment. You could have the best job at a stagnant company,
Mm-hmm.
and have like a lousy experience. And then you could have, the seemingly crappiest job at a great growing company, and you're going to get so many more, opportunities for growth. And so just being somewhere that's like growing attracts smart people and provides opportunity. And I actually think that is more important than any other, aspect. And ultimately, I joined Spotify not for the role that it was, but for the company that it could be. And I think things have worked out fairly well, having onboarded a rocket ship.
Yeah, absolutely. And now, sadly, on to our closing question. We like to ask this of all of our guests. So, what is your boldest, most interesting, unique prediction of how the world is going to be different 5 to 8 years from now? So, like, what do you truly believe in your heart will happen, even though it might seem like a moonshot to everyone else?
Yeah, I don't know how counterintuitive this one is, but it's something I've been spending quite a lot of time thinking about, which is, what will life be like post pandemic?
Right.
And I really think that like work from anywhere and
Mm-hmm.
school from anywhere is like here to stay. Like I don't see us going back. I think it won't be as extreme as this. I think it'll be more of a hybrid model, but I do think we've seen a permanent shift. I think that the productivity software is coming online and coming of age very quickly. I think corporations have seen that they could be just as, if not more productive in such a world. And Spotify is like fully leaned in.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's going to have some pretty profound impacts on society. I think it'll mean less brain drain from the middle of the country to the coasts, which means that folks have already returned back home and are likely to set up roots. I think others will think twice about relocating because they won't have to. And so by having talent more geographically dispersed, I'm very hopeful for what that means for our income inequality challenges, some of the geopolitical challenges, and a lot of the division that we see. And so I'm quite hopeful that by having the talent base specifically for knowledge workers, high income earners, be more balanced, that will result in a more balanced Main Street economy and society. So hey, I don't know how unique that is, but I'm quite hopeful.
Yeah, no, it should be really interesting to see what happens after the pandemic. I know everyone here at Wharton is really eager to get back into the classroom and back at Bonner's, which is our local pub. So, but with that, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. This was really interesting, and best of luck with Ad Studio.
My pleasure. Thank you guys for taking the time. This was fun.
Thanks so much, Jay.
Cheers.